right. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for attending the keynote discussion for Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month at Eastern Washington University with Professor Sumi Okazaki. My name is Steve Bingo, and I will be your facilitator today. And as we get started, I'd like to give a lot of thanks to Lisa Logan, who is behind the scenes, making sure that this all runs smoothly. Let's see, before we get started, I would like to thank all those who had helped with the planning of AAPI Heritage Month, because it's an ambitious month of programming that we have for you this month. So the members of the committee are Puyan Lam, Chin Stelwagen, Frances Grace Mortel, Dylan Deffenbaugh, Michael Ochi, Pedro Michaud, Vanessa Delgado, Lisa Logan, and of course me. So our sponsors who have helped us put together events throughout the month of May are the Multicultural Center, the Department of Geography and Anthropology, the EWU Film Society, Eagle Entertainment, Eagle Sound, ASEWU, the EWU Libraries, Student Activities Involvement and Leadership, Gender, Women's and Sexuality Studies, the Women's and Gender Education Center, the Office of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, the Department of Sociology and Justice Studies, and the Asian Pacific Islander Coalition Spokane chapter, or you may otherwise know them as APIC. So the plan for today is, after some really brief opening remarks, Professor Okazaki will say a few words about her recent research on the experience of Asian Americans as they navigate the crises of COVID and racism. I want to let you know that questions are welcome throughout through the Q&A button on the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Also, the session is being recorded and live streamed, and the session recording and slides will be accessible through the AAPI Month Library Resources page. And at least throughout the month of May, there will also be links from the AAPI Month event page. After Professor Okazaki's prepared remarks, which will wrap up around 35 or 40 minutes into the hour, we will start delving into those questions. So because today we will touch upon issues of visibility that fit within a larger context of immigration and colonialism, I want to make sure that Indigenous histories remain visible, that discussions of equality and belonging require an understanding that we all benefit from lands that were, and in many cases still are, claimed by Indigenous Americans. In keeping with this, we at Eastern acknowledge that the land on which the campus sits is the traditional homelands of the Spokane people, while also having connection to Indigenous groups who have a shared history within the region. So at this point, we're very pleased to have Professor Sumi Okazaki as a speaker for AAPI Heritage Month. And at this point, I'll give a shout out to Professor Michael Zukoski for suggesting Dr. Okazaki, who herself is a professor of applied psychology at New York University Steinhardt School. And her research covers several topics salient to Asian and Asian American experience across various generational, national, and class contexts. Currently, Dr. Okazaki and her colleague, Dr. Doris Chang, are leading the NYU CARA project, which examines how Asian Americans are navigating the specific historical moment in light of the COVID pandemic, heightened racism against Asian Americans, and protests for racial equality arising after the death of George Floyd. These phenomena have overlapping consequences for Americans of Asian and Pacific Islander descent. While this confluence of events is unique, the project places this within a larger story about AAPI communities in relation to other communities of color. In this crucial time for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, I can think of no better way to kick off this month of celebration, yes, but also examination, than to learn more about Professor Okazaki's research. So without further ado, put your hands together, virtual or real, for Professor Sumi Okazaki. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm gonna share my slides. And before I begin my talk, I would also like to acknowledge that my institution, New York University, is located in ancestral Lenape homeland. And we recognize and honor the longstanding significance of the lands for the Lenape nations past and present. It's important, I think, as we celebrate AAPI Heritage Month to understand how each of us, Asian American Pacific Islander community, came to reside on this land, how we are now active participants in this American project, and how we take up the work in solidarity with Indigenous communities to combat racism and discrimination. And thinking about our relationship with Native American and Indigenous land and its people, it's also, I think, a reminder for me that even though we often talk about Asian American and Pacific Islander population as if we're a homogeneous one racial category, it's important to remember that Native American, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities have long been subject to violent US colonization in ways that many people of Asian ancestries have not. And so I want to acknowledge that the limits of my knowledge as I speak primarily on basis of the work that I've done with Asian American individuals and families that I've sought in my studies. That said, I want to share some of the work that I've done, engaged in over the past decade or so that touch on experiences with and the cost of racism in our communities and how we can move forward toward healing and solidarity. So my plan for the short time that we have together, I'm going to briefly share lessons that I've learned from three projects: the Korean American Family Project, the Racial Microaggression Study, and then the CARE project that Dr. Bingo mentioned. And then tomorrow, or next steps, I hope to be able to share some thoughts on where we go from here and some of the resources that we need in order to do to engage in the next step. And because the bulk of the research that I'll be presenting is based on the collaborative work that I've done with my late colleague Nancy Abelman, based on a book that 2019 book that was published called Korean American Families in Immigrant America: How Teens and Parents Navigate Race. That Nancy was an equal and wonderful partner in the work that we did together, and it's my regret that she didn't get to see the publication of the work that we have engaged in together. And I'm going to situate the work. So I'm going to spend a chunk of time talking about the Korean American project, mostly because it's sort of a story of how Nancy and I, when we began the work, weren't really thinking race. We were thinking much more quote unquote culture. And because we were at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign together, which is not on this map, it's downstate or central, east central Illinois, but most of the students the Korean American students, college students that we were encountering were from Chicagoland. And so we, as we began our studies together, we started, with our campus study, and, we kind of tried to understand, I think, especially, Nancy being a cultural anthropologist, where ethnography was her method of choice, and to be really grounded in the context, both historical and geographic context of the places that were inhabited by our informants. And so we understood, based on Nancy's previous work with the Korean American community, that, Korean American and Asian American population in Chicago were extensively suburbanized. And so there was not a whole lot of urban, especially Korean Americans, left. And so kind of geographically speaking, this is sort of the change in Asian American Pacific Islander population in Chicago from 1990 to 2000, where you can see the extensive suburbanization that were happening. So by 2000, 3/4 of the API communities were in the suburbs rather than in sort of the urban centers right here. And then just to kind of remind us that Chicago is also, as with many other American urban centers, a very segregated city in terms of racial and ethnic background, so that the setting of the work that Nancy and I did are in these sort of a northern suburbs of Chicago, not quite the lakeshore, but in the north suburbs of Chicago. And I think this context of just, how we think about Korean American families in Chicagoland in terms of the landscape, I think kind of is a foreground to the work and another characteristic that we were, attending to in terms of the Korean Americans in Chicago, and I think this is true of many Korean American communities in other parts of the country, are that I think demographically speaking, Korean Americans have high rates of small entrepreneurship, meaning that about 20% of Korean Americans, according to the census, are self-employed, which is the highest of any American ethnic group, twice that of white Americans as well as other Asian American groups. And every community has ethnic specific businesses. So dry cleaning business and and you'll see later on nail salons were the dominant small entrepreneur businesses that Korean American families were engaging in. And so Nancy and I started this work first, on campus by talking to Korean American, South Asian American, and white American students from the same suburbs, the northern suburbs of Chicago, because we wanted to kind of get a sense of how they shared the, sort of the geography growing up and going to schooling in those spaces, and then how they narrated their experience of growing up in their families. So we surveyed the students, and then we selected students from those surveys that were especially, indicating that, they were dissatisfied with their families or were distressed about their, circumstances. I'm just going to share a couple of narrative quotes to kind of set the scene for what we were starting to understand about Korean American college students. And so this might, sound somewhat familiar to many Asian Americans or their, adults who come into contact with them. So one female student said, "I think it's just because my parents are still very Koreanized, and I learned. I grew up in America, and I grew up with an American culture. So their idea of success is being a doctor, being a professor, like the number one, just like money-making jobs. But then, for me, I want to do what I want to do, what I love." Now, just a personal note that the student didn't know that professors are not the money-making number one money-making jobs, but never mind that. She does kind of talk about her parents' ideas of success diverging from her own, and that what she really wanted to do was to work in the church as a teacher or a missionary, and that was not what her parents saw as a successful outcome of her education. A couple more quotes, and so when we asked them to talk about the family, I think what we observed was that these Korean American students were referencing, being Korean, but in a very particular way. So one student said, "No, my family's not typically Korean. I'm going to put a stereotype on Koreans, but like the Korean father runs a cleaner, and then on Sundays he plays golf, and the children are neglected. And my parents, they're pretty modern, I think, in my opinion. They adjust to change pretty well, so they adjust to the white people in our neighborhood, so we wouldn't stand out too much." Another student said, "I really feel like how close our family is now is something that's really rare you'll find in other Korean families. I actually feel that our expressions of love and things like that and support have become more Americanized," right? And so from these narratives, they're snippets of longer conversations, but Nancy and I were starting to hear sort of references to what does it mean to be Korean? What does it mean to be American? And what does it mean to not, be a typical Korean? So what we were learning from that campus study that got us out into the field was that, the Korean American college students were largely acknowledging that they're, growing up in immigrant household was hard. And many, had talked about the parents working really long hours and not really being home or not being able to participate in their sports or, after school activities, um, or, having distant relationship or, language barriers or whatnot. And many marked Koreanness as negative, even if they were talking about their families in a positive way, it was because they were not typically Korean. Yet most of the students also found ways to quote unquote redeem their families through empathy and understanding. And so, we started to pay attention to this sort of it's not a contradiction or paradox, but there's this apparent resilience that even though they narrate pretty difficult childhood, that they also are able to kind of narrate coming to terms with and becoming resilient over time, given the their now distance from the family of origin. And so going into the field, what we wanted to understand was, how does it unfold over time in families? And what we were hearing from college students, the redeeming portraits of their family, was it because they're away from home? Is it because they're just kind of emerging as adult, independent adults? Is it because of the racial identity formation that happens often in college? Or does it, the process start in adolescence? And more importantly, we wanted to talk to the parents and see what they felt were, their conversations about raising Korean American kids. And so we launched it, what eventually became a book-length manuscript was a project that started out with a field work where we did a lot of trips from Central Illinois to Chicago. We had a number of talented graduate students and wonderful ethnographers who also took copious notes on best Korean restaurants in various neighborhoods. And we visited many churches and attended, church services, church PTA meetings, church retreats, because a lot of Korean American life happens in church settings. We also, spoke with some of the school administrators that with a high number of Korean American student enrollment, and permission to shadow some of the students and interview administrators and social workers and so forth. And then we did a survey of 186 teens and 97 of their parents. And from that survey, we selected about a dozen families that we were interested in talking to, and ended up with 5 families who allowed us to follow them intensively for over a course of 1.5 to 2 years. And then just by virtue of not finishing the book manuscript for a long time, we ended up kind of going back, to each family, year after year, as Nancy and I worked on the book manuscript to get updates. And it ended up an inadvertently longitudinal project. So we ended up following the families for about 8 years, which was actually a fortunate thing, because we were able to really witness, sort of what it was like for families as their teens, moved into college and then beyond college into young adulthood. And, we started out with the observation that the Korean college students, when we, in the surveys, the Korean college students, their reports of depressive symptoms were not significantly correlated with their satisfaction with the family. That that there was sort of the distance, that emotional distance that we had observed in college students. That was not the case with Korean teens. If their family life was unsatisfactory, they were also feeling depressed. And so with the 5 families that we portrayed in the book, we have 3 boys and 2 girls that were sort of the central foci of our ethnography. But we also, paid attention to the parents' occupation, the parents' immigrant journeys and their, what were the sort of the primary struggle that, over which our ethnography team was witness to their many conversations, both separately with the teens and young adults, as well as, in family conversations. We often, our research team would often visit, with the family, with some of the parents that were small entrepreneurs. They let us, visit their places of work, if they were video store owners or dry cleaner store owners. They let us just kind of hang out in the store for a couple hours at a time. Sometimes we would go with kids to move, to malls. Remember those times? Or we follow them into music concerts or softball games or church settings, church retreats, and so forth. So we spent a lot of time with each of the families in many different iterations over time. And one family story that I'm just going to share briefly with you is this family with a Catholic family who, at the time of the intensive work that we were doing, the parents owned and operated a dry cleaning store, and the central focus that brought their family to us in the work was the son's social relationship and racism. And so it's very hard to talk about a book-length work in a short research presentation. So I'm just going to read brief excerpts from the chapter on the story of Ben and his family, which we subtitled as Parenting for Racialized America, just so you can kind of get a sense of the kind of analysis that we were doing based on repeated encounters with this family. And these are all pseudonyms. And the family name the family pseudonym we gave was the Coe family. So we first encountered Mrs. Coe, Ben's mother, at a church parent meeting. And she began her comments in this kind of a public forum that we did by stating that she had two children. Jean was in 6th grade and Ben was in 8th grade at the time, and that they had formerly lived in the city of Chicago, but had moved to East Creek, a Chicago North Shore suburb, known for its outstanding public schools. She added that it's been hard for her boys to make friends following the family's move, but that after some time, Ben began bringing home a few quote-unquote American friends. Mrs. Coe was troubled to observe that her son seemed to be subservient to these friends, acting as if he felt the need to cater to them. She said, instead of just thinking of them as friends, he seemed to think he needs to serve them, was how she put it. Some of this, she surmised, was about the difficulties of needing to fit into an already well-established social circle of youth in East Creek who had known each other since they were youngsters. The difficulty of squeezing into middle of strong relationships that were already established as a new kid in town. However, Mrs. Coe felt frustrated and angry to find that her son acting this way and ventured a very racial interpretation of the situation, that Ben was not psychologically strong enough to think of white American friends as real or good friends or his equals. In passing, she also mentioned that the white children in question were Jewish. She told the parent group at the church that she had purposely made efforts to distance Ben from these children. Addressing both Nancy and her fellow parents assembled there, she asked, how can I solve this problem? Mrs. Coe would later share with Una, one of her graduate researchers, what it was about Ben's behavior that had struck her as subservient. In one instance, she had watched Ben comply with one of his friends when one of his friends had ordered him to fetch him a waste paper basket when the boys were hanging out at their house. For Mrs. Coe, that her son would comply in this manner spoke to his, and more largely Korean Americans' lack of confidence as members of a racial minority interacting with whites in the United States. Over the course of our research engagement with Ben's mother, that year and in the following years, she returned occasionally to the observations she shared that day. but more often she spoke with the general matter of Ben's well-being in the United States. It was above all Ben's psychological well-being that, time and again, most seemed to concern Mrs. Coe. She was enormously worried about his future, anguishing in particular over whether he had what it took constitution-wise to make it in America. Mrs. Coe went so far as to venture a diagnosis that Ben's retiring manner and lack of self-confidence were inextricably tied to what she viewed as ethnic self-loathing, especially prevalent among Asian American boys, according to Mrs. Coe. And that his low ethnic self-regard was born from his experience of racism against immigrants in the United States. As we came to know the family, we discovered that Mrs. Coe's worries about Ben were hardly an isolated issue. Her angst, as it turned out, touched on her own and her husband's immigration histories as well as her concerns about her husband's temperament. In Ben, Mrs. Coe could not help but see the constellation of personality features that she also saw in her husband and that she believed made their immigrant lives in America so challenging. Her husband's passivity, shyness, and even femininity. As an aside, upon meeting Mr. Coe, Jin Han, who was our own male research assistant, also concurred that Mr. Coe did not speak or behave like a typically quote-unquote macho Korean man of his age. However, Una also observed him to be fairly extroverted outside home. On one dinner outing with Mr. and Mrs. Coe at a seafood restaurant, Mr. Coe even engaged extensively in an English conversation with a friendly waiter. Yet, Mrs. Coe's reflection made clear that immigration is an intergenerational project and that when parents reflect on the very ways in which the United States acts upon their immigrant children, they necessarily think about their own immigration story, and in particular, about their own racial experience. We found that parents' concern about race were echoed in one form or another across the families we met in this book. However, Mrs. Coe, at the time of her initial encounter with her family, had most vocally expressed the parental anxiety of Korean American immigrant parents. That is, does my family have what it takes to thrive in this country? I don't speak much more about Ben and what happened to him over the course of the time that we knew him and his family. But what I hope you are getting from that brief excerpt is a sense that Korean American parents that we spoke with at length were grappling in very different ways. Each family had their own ways of talking about how their immigration journey had been, and their settlement in the United States have been impacted by race and racism. And so, some of the big takeaways from the family project on race and racism, and it's certainly not where Nancy and I started, that we were much more interested in how families were talking about cultural, adaptation and what it meant to be Korean and what it meant to be American. But I think where we ended up in this book was much more of a meditation on race and racism. And so that, immigration and parents' experiences with daily racism exact, considerable toll on their intergenerational relationships, and that racial calculations, such as the one that Ben's parents engaged in or other families talked to us about, are very much part of the psychological labor that the parents were talking with us at length, and in kind. Teens were also talking to us as they grew into emerging adults about their own racialized experiences and how they felt about the way that parents had tried to parent around them. And then, certainly parents struggle over time with how to best raise their children for US racial realities, and that sometimes they have regrets, sometimes they take a different tack, and so forth. And so the strategies diverge across families and fluctuated over time. And so with that work behind us, I had occasions to also engage in different kinds of work on the themes of race and racism. And, you know, a lot of the race and racism that were in, you know, that the Korean American parents and kids were talking about might be, you know, categorized as racial microaggression, although there were moments in, especially Mrs. Ko's family, where they talked about their, you know, house being egged, or, you know, having to call the police because of racial incident, racial animosity from the neighbors. But certainly, I think most of the racism that the parents and kids talk to are sort of this, you know, everyday insult, everyday, you know, invalidation of their racial realities. You know, what psychologists and I think now in the public discourse have understand as racial microaggression. So in this one study conducted, you know, primarily by Gloria von Padunpat, who's now an assistant professor in the psychology department at UNLV, was an experimental study to see to what extent in laboratory we can actually assess the impact of these kind of low-level, you know, racial microaggression on Asian Americans. And so in this laboratory study, each Asian American participant was brought into, you know, sort of a college laboratory, and, you know, were greeted by a research assistant who, you know, always greeted them saying, "Do you speak English? I mean, is English your first language?" And for many Asian Americans, this is a, you know, familiar type of, you know, question that no matter what we say, or no matter how many generations our families may have been in this country, there's always this sort of perpetual foreigner stereotype cast upon us that, there's a suspicion that, you know, our English, if we speak good English, it's not because we're native born, or we learned it as a first language. But anyway, so in this study, this was the racial microaggression, manipulation, and that the race of the research assistant who, you know, kind of asked the Asian American participant to kind of respond to this question. And in fact, after this question, the participant, you know, invariably said, "Yes, I do speak English." That they were asked to read aloud the consent form just to make sure. And so that was like a little bit more of a accentuated kind of a racial microaggression. But we varied the race of the experimenter. And what we found was that the perpetrator's race was related to the physiological stress that we measured in the Asian American participants, and that this relationship of white research assistant who was white researcher who asked them to, you know, read aloud English passage was associated with increased physiological stress, and that pathway was mediated not by explicit self-esteem. That is, Asian American participants didn't explicitly say that they felt bad about it, but when we measured their implicit self-esteem, that was sort of the mediated path, partial mediated pathway through which their physiological stress seemed to be increasing. So that is one sort of a brief experimental evidence to show that, you know, these small moments that many Asian Americans experience on a daily basis do, have, a physiological, reaction that can accumulate in more, health or other mental health issues later on. So that brings me to the current moment in which my collaborator Doris Chang and I began the study we began to plan this study last summer during the extended, pandemic, and during the summer of protest following George Floyd's murder. that we wanted to understand how Asian Americans were experiencing COVID-19 stressors, and especially the racial discrimination in context of what else was happening in the study. So we collected our data through a Qualtrics panel in December 2020. And we collected data from nearly 700 participants. And we wanted this study to be inclusive because we were kind of mindful of the fact that, even though a lot of the attention on anti-Asian racism were focused on East Asians, we were also mindful that, Asian Americans at large, South Asian, Southeast Asian, and multi-racial, multi-ethnic communities are also, being kind of directly or indirectly referenced as Asian Americans in this. And so, and we had, overrepresentation of women in this convenient sample, but we were happy to see that we did have, some respondents, who were older, as well as, the sort of the typical college age participants, and we had, a good number of young adults as well. And we had majority born in the United States and majority, U.S. citizens, mostly in metropolitan areas, California, New York. So, although we had participants from across 43 states, we also, our participants also mirrored, sort of the patterns of residential place of residence in the United States. And what we found was that, over the course, and we had asked them to report on their experiences from, start of the pandemic up until December 2020. So this is even before the recent, spate of much more violent racial encounters that's been reported in the past several months. That, a third of our participants reported being, others avoiding them or shunning them because of race. Third also reported in-person, verbal harassment and name calling, whereas about half also reported being directly harassed or name called online. And 1 in 8 had also reported physically assaulting, being physically assaulted because of Asian background. So our study is, at the preliminary stages of analysis, but we are seeing, much like other reporting portals of Asian American discrimination, that Asian Americans at large are experiencing and reporting, a fair amount of racism, racial discrimination and racial harassment. And, at this stage, we're starting to look at the relationship between, different forms of discrimination and mental health. And, it's probably no surprise to you that those who report higher levels of discrimination, direct or vicarious, in person or online, those folks also report, higher symptoms of depression, anxiety, and worry. And this is especially true for younger people in our sample. And it was also, stronger for in-person direct attacks. And so, as we go forward in our study, we're hoping to look at inter-ethnic differences in the experiences with anti-Asian discrimination and mental health, but also, we collected a lot of data around the ways that they coped, their social support, as well as, what we thought of as sort of a pro-social, instead of individual coping, sort of a collective coping through, either volunteering for causes or protesting, as part of the Black Lives Matter movement or other forms of kind of civic engagement that we thought might be, um, um, you know, potentially related to how they cope with discrimination and how, whether that's related to their mental health. And so I'd say stay tuned for, more elaborated results later in the summer as we continue this work. So in the final minutes, I just want to, speak especially to the students who at this moment, might, on top of the challenges of the pandemic, you might be feeling beaten down by just the seemingly endless news of racial violence and racism directed against Asian American communities as well as other communities of color. That, certainly as psychologists, I can't say enough about practicing self-care, but I think it's also important, I think, for us as, community to, learn about Asian Pacific American history and culture. If there's a chance for you to take a formal Asian Pacific American Studies course, that might be available at your university or in other settings, certainly do that. That's not something that I had an opportunity as, I went to a university that didn't at the time have Asian American Studies. And so a lot of what I had to, learn was kind of, on my own and in communities as a professional. But certainly there are lots of APA authors and with Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, there are lots of great reading lists out there. And then I think PBS series on Asian Americans I saw on the EWU activities that there's a discussion. So certainly that sounds like a incredible way to connect to history and to be able to think about our role in American history that isn't just about racial victimization, but also about resistance and being part of the movement to contest unfair treatment. And then certainly there are lots of other online sources and toolkits that are out there to learn and talk about racism. And always put in a plug for supporting local APA-owned businesses. And then finally, I think it's important, as we continue this work, to find like-minded folks, groups, organizations working on anti-racism efforts, also to join in multi-racial coalitions so that you become an ally and accomplice in the work rather than to work only in Asian American spaces. And then I'll find a way, with the organizers of this forum to share these resources. But certainly there are lots of other really helpful, compilation of resources in terms of resisting racism and acts of racial violence, but also how to, take care of each other and ourselves in terms of mental health. So I think with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back over to Dr. Bingo.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Okazaki. That was a very good condensation of a body of work, and I know it was challenging to get it in, but there was a lot of great points and takeaways there. And just to let you know that we will share the slides through the library website, but certainly if there's any other resources, please do send those to us as well. Okay, so I want to start with the questions from the audience. The first question is from Deborah Cano. And she asks, how do you think that Asian Americans might experience racism differently from other communities of color, African Americans, Latinx, Native American individuals? And I think there may be a couple of dimensions that we may want to think about just hearing one of your earlier talks. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we could talk about whether in terms of we're talking about voluntary immigrants, like many Latinx, or involuntary immigrants in the case of African Americans, and obviously indigenous folks are not immigrants at all, but certainly suffer from racism.
Yeah. And again, I think, there is no one Asian American experience, right? I mean, I think that's the difficulty of doing this work with Asian American communities is that I think sometimes a coalition can be very fraught because, there's just, sometimes I think we share the experience of being racialized. A lot of times, our histories are different, our cultures, religion, our privileges as either, visa holders or citizens versus those who are, documentation challenged are, certainly different. That said, I think, some of the main ways in which Asian Americans are racialized and, the ways that racial experiences happen for Asian Americans are, sort of the two stereotypes that I'm sure many of you have already heard, in other settings, the model minority stereotypes of, being seen, and also kind of, you know, the model minority stereotype of Asian Americans being seen as not only hardworking and high achieving, but also non-complaining and not making trouble, right? And so that those stereotypes, I think, are very difficult to dislodge. Partly, I think, because many Asian American immigrants and, I think Asian Americans themselves take up that stereotype as, seemingly positive stereotype. What's wrong with being seen as hardworking, high achieving Americans? But, I think, in relation to other groups, I mean, I think we have to remember that model minority stereotype, circulated widely during the civil rights era in, I think, to, almost as a, to use Asian Americans as a wedge between, whites and other ethnic minorities. And so the Asian Americans were held up as the model for other, Black and brown communities to say, see, Asian Americans are, also experiencing challenges. They're immigrants. They, came with nothing, but look how well they're doing without complaining. So I think, it's modern minority stereotype, even though it's about, it's cast upon Asian Americans, it's essentially an anti-Black, anti-brown, you know, uh, racism, racial stereotype that I think keeps Asian Americans certainly from being seen and heard. And then I think the other stereotype that I think I mentioned earlier is the perpetual foreigner stereotype, that there's the assumption that Asian Americans are unassimilable and at times a threat, so that in times of national threats such as COVID or war, Asian Americans, I think, are more likely to be scapegoated for being, insidious threats, and lots of, excuse me, historical and contemporary racial violence happens around that foreigner stereotype. And so I think those are the ways in which Asian Americans are experiencing racism in a ways that might be slightly different from other communities.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, your talk about that actually reminds me of a recent Saturday Night Live episode with Daniel Kaluuya, where you see the African immigrant family kind of embodying, the immigrant mentality, which very much crosses over into model minorities. So it's kind of interesting how that plays out differently or perpetuates itself more depending upon your racial identity within the United States. Okay. Next question from Michael Zukoski. He asks, do you have any suggestion about recognizing collective coping strategies for people struggling against racism in non-democratic societies in which local cultural histories are stifled? So maybe countries like, I don't know, I'm guessing like Myanmar or other sorts of more totalitarian, Russia perhaps. Yeah.
Gosh, that's a big question. I feel like it's a little bit out of my wheelhouse. I think, but certainly I think, what that question reveals to me is just how connected, many of our communities are as diasporic communities, and that, what happens in other parts of the world directly affect us. This week or in last week, we know that many of our South Asian, friends and colleagues from India are worried sick about what's happening with COVID situation in India. So um, certainly, I think there are models of Asian Americans throughout history working outside of the country as diasporic communities to in resistance to what is happening. And certainly, I think there's lots of great examples of that throughout history, and also I think in terms of the support of Uyghurs or Myanmar communities that are located within the United States. And so to the extent that we can work, I think in coalition with, the diaspora communities to support, but, of course it's, I think, difficult when there's such authoritarian forces in place that, are difficult to, dislodge from outside. But certainly I think we one thing that we can do is to continue to listen to people who are bearing witness to that and what's happening, and to amplify their voices.
Wonderful. Yeah, this next question I like very much, and I'm going to kind of meld it with a question that I have. And the asker is Puyan Lam, and she asks, what can university communities do to help facilitate the healing for Asian American students from the negative impacts of the current rise of anti-Asian, Asian American racism? And I think one thing that I'd like to add to that is you mentioned that racism puts an extra stress on intergenerational relationships amongst immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
So to kind of go along with that, are there any kind of factors that you see that kind of help, or are there any ways that students or parents frame racism within that study that create greater resilience and a better understanding that helps alleviate that stress?
Yeah, so again, there's a lot in those questions. I think first in terms of the university, certainly I think creating spaces like this, but, it shouldn't just be like Asian American Pacific, Islander Month. I think we would want to see continuous spaces for Asian American students and community to be able to, share experiences. I mean, I think a lot of times, I think, with regard to families, many of us grew up in families where we didn't talk about race, unlike, I think, many Black parents who, unfortunately have to socialize their kids and have that talk about, what to do in encounters with police officers, or what to do in terms of, how to navigate race. Even though I think the work that Nancy and I did with Korean American families and parents, there were lots of talks about race, but I think in terms of what parents are doing to socialize their kids around, race and racism, I think Asian American families have not, had as much of a, experience or practice of doing that. Partly, I think, it's a cultural belief that, many parents thought, it's better not to talk about negative things, that, that makes it worse in some cases. That's sort of the belief. Sometimes the parents are, busy just gaining an economic foothold in the country and dealing with their own, trauma or, racism. And so there's not as much of a headspace for families to engage in that. And so I think as, more attentions are being paid, in the recent month about, the impact of racism on Asian Americans, I think many of us are finding language and voices to speak about that, and creating, toolkits and, ways to talk about race. And so for now, for example, I mean, this is more for, parents of younger children, but, psychologists have created, tools in different languages for parents to talk about racism with their kids. I think even Sesame Street Workshop recently did a video about how a Korean American family with 3 young children were talking about race and racism with their kids. And so I think the more we can kind of create opportunities to share our stories and to, kind of feel like we're not alone in what we're sharing, to, I think to destigmatize talk about, race and racism, mental health, our impact, I think can go, some ways. I mean, it's not going to solve all problems, but certainly I think to create more spaces for us to have that conversation and to think about, what can we do to facilitate, that voice, and to see that as part of, the resistance, see that as part of our resilience, I think is, one way to think about that.
Okay, great. Well, we're coming to the end, but I just want to ask a quick follow-up to that. Do you have any examples or any tools for perhaps like students who may want to have that talk with their parents if their parents come from a country where discrimination isn't along lines of race, but maybe upon some other factors to kind of teach up, as it were?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's not really my tool, but I know that, I think especially last summer, and this started, I think, shortly following the, Michael Brown and his death in Ferguson, that young Asian American people started, I think it's called like Letter About Black Lives or something like that, a conversation with their immigrant parents to just kind of explain what Black Lives Matter movement is about and how to, kind of understand structural racism. And it's sort of a crowd sourcing kind of a movement that I, think it's an interesting way to think about, and in the letter, I think got wordsmith over, the course of months across, different communities, and it got translated into multiple Asian languages. And I've heard of young people using that letter as a starting point to have conversations with their parents. I mean, of course, I think, it's important for a younger generation to also remember that the parents also have their own stories. Sometimes, the parents may not have wanted to share, the stories of hardship. And that, parents are kind of looking more for opportunities for kids to thrive in the country. And so I think it's important for each generation to kind of understand where they're coming from. But certainly I think there are kind of online tools that have been crowdsourced and, developed sort of organically to facilitate that. And if I think of other resources, I'll certainly share later on.
Okay, well, Professor Okazaki, I know you have places to get to, but thank you so much for sharing with us. This has been a really great discussion this afternoon. And a thank you from the audience for using Ally and Accomplice in your PowerPoint, so get the thumbs up. So yeah, I mean, at this point, let's all give a hand, although obviously you can't hear us, but so thank you.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate the invitation, and I hope someday that maybe I can visit in person instead of online.
Yes, we would love that. Great. Thank you so much. Okay, so in the chat, you'll see links for future AAPI month events, and we got a lot of great programming. This is just the start. Everything from a couple of panels on identity to cultural conversation. There's something I'm really looking forward to, a screening of Minari at the end of the month with a discussion on the 28th. We have some bystander training, a couple of cooking classes. I don't have a deep fryer, but I want to know how to make lumpia. That sounds great. As well as a discussion of the PBS documentary series that came out, I believe, earlier this year. So anyways, thank you so much. And I hope to see you again, everybody at future AAPI month events. So I guess we say thank you.